The first documents surfaced by accident, not through excavation, but through routine cataloguing. A municipal ledger from 1888, bound in fading cloth and indexed under drainage improvements, listed street works across central Belgrade with the dry precision of accounting rather than discovery. Line after line recorded, cubic meters of earth removed, labor hours approved, masonry quantities ordered, and completion dates stamped in identical ink. It was the depths that slowed me. Trenches descending far beyond what ordinary sewer channels required, costs inflated without explanation, marginal notes added weeks later, compressed into the edges of the page, referencing reinforced arches, temporary timbering, and expedited refilling schedules, not the language of pipes and runoff, the language of something structural. Maps accompanied several entries, folded sheets, creased from repeated handling, showing narrow corridors beneath thoroughfares that had no business hosting them. Vaulted forms penciled lightly, as though the drafter hesitated to emphasize what he was recording. Cross-sections stopped mid-page, clipped before they reached natural soil. The names attached to these records revealed nothing personal. Surveyors identified only by initials, engineers signing off with formal stamps, clerks approving expenditures without comment. The city appeared in fragments, a machine communicating with itself through paper. Nothing in the archive called the work unusual, yet the numbers refused to cooperate. Excavation depths exceeded foundation standards. Brick thicknesses rivaled load-bearing walls. Timber braces were requisitioned in quantities reserved for tunnels, not cellars. And everywhere, the same instruction repeated in the margins. Backfill immediately, seal access, restore, surface grade. No diagrams survived beyond rough drafts. Several plates were referenced, but never filed. Payment orders arrived faster than review schedules allowed. Entire sections of work were marked complete within days of discovery. It felt procedural, efficient, almost bored. That was what unsettled me. If something unexpected had been uncovered beneath Belgrade's streets, the records did not panic. They adapted. They reorganized budgets, accelerated labor, and erased detail with quiet competence. By the final pages, one phrase appeared, often enough to stop reading like coincidence. Vaulted void encountered. No measurements attached. No justification offered. Only a new column added to the ledger. Earth removed. Stone installed. Surface restored. The street, according to official memory, had never changed. And yet the paperwork suggested otherwise. Somewhere between the numbers, between the truncated diagrams and the hurried authorizations, something solid had forced the city to rewrite its plans. The archive did not explain what that thing was. It merely recorded how quickly it had been covered. The ledger entries pointed toward drawings that no longer existed in full, but the council minutes preserved their titles with bureaucratic indifference. Cross-sections of roadway reinforcements, structural reinforcement schematics, subsurface stabilization plates. I followed those references into a separate collection, where oversized folders were stacked by district and year, each stamped with dates clustered around the same months in 1888. The diagrams that remained were precise in a way that made them difficult to dismiss. Arches sketched beneath streets too narrow to justify them, load calculations extending far beyond surface traffic, masonry thicknesses rivaling those of civic buildings rather than drainage channels. Elevation profiles showed stairs descending into spaces labeled only as maintenance corridors, though their ceiling heights exceeded anything required for inspection access. Some sections hinted at chambers that did not sit naturally within surrounding strata, as though older volumes had been adapted instead of created. Annotations crowded the margins, survey numbers revised, brick counts recalculated, foundation depth circled, then rewritten. Foreman initialed changes without explanation. Archivists later stamped approvals across corners that cut through measurements. The omissions arrived later. Summaries prepared months afterward described routine utility improvements. No arches, no vaulted ceilings, no oversized masonry cores. Entire structural features disappeared between draft and final report. Several plates were referenced repeatedly yet filed nowhere. Scale bars shifted between copies of the same drawing. Funding tables redirected masonry orders into resurfacing budgets. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Something documented carefully at first had become inconvenient by the time it reached official memory. By the end of the file, one clerk had penciled a note beside a missing cross-section. Revised per directive. No directive was attached. Only silence where the geometry had been. The drawings led naturally to photographs, though they were never filed alongside engineering reports. They appeared instead in restoration dossiers, tucked between facade, assessments, and mortar analyses, taken decades later for reasons that had nothing to do with 19th century excavation. Basement windows sat beneath sidewalks. Stone frames half submerged in asphalt, decorative arches clipped by pavement lines. Iron grates positioned where ground level should have been, not 2 meters above them. I began treating each image as a measurement exercise rather than an aesthetic record. Brick courses counted upward from buried sills, stair landings traced downward from street doors, handrails terminating where floors no longer existed. Several buildings required 3 full steps down before reaching what modern plans labeled the ground floor. Others showed staircases that began below the sidewalk and continued deeper still, their lower portions walled off during later refurbishments. Construction crews appeared only as permit numbers. Heritage boards surfaced through approval stamps, and cautionary language about historical character preservation. The documents never asked why windows had sunk. They simply accommodated the fact that they had. Contemporary renovations reopened sealed levels beneath courtyards and service corridors. Contractors drilled into voids that did not appear on cadastral maps. Soil layers, recorded in core samples, varied abruptly, from 1 meter to the next. Dense clay pressed atop brickwork, then compacted gravel sealing older masonry. Municipal statements responded carefully: routine redevelopment, historical quirks, no cause for concern. But the images kept aligning with the 19th century cross-sections, sublevels that should not have existed, stories that had been lowered rather than removed, and foundations that looked less like construction than inheritance. The photographs suggested buried stories. The soil confirmed something heavier. Core samples taken beneath courtyards and service corridors were lobbed decades after the original excavations, part of routine redevelopment surveys that rarely attract attention beyond engineering firms and zoning committees. Cylinders of compressed earth, sealed in plastic sleeves, stacked in storage rooms beside foundation reports and drainage plans. I read them like timelines. Dark loam near the surface, modern fill beneath it. Then abruptly, a dense clay band pressed so tightly it resisted coring equipment. Beneath that, brick dust, lime mortar, cut stone fragments, and below those, gravel layers, compacted with a force that did not match gradual settling. River records became necessary. Floodplain maps, seasonal rainfall logs from the late 19th century, municipal accounts of overflow events along the Sava and Danube. None recorded a deluge large enough to deposit uniform sediment across entire districts, let alone seal masonry beneath meters of compressed earth. Laboratory stamps replaced faces, petrographic analyses signed by initials, grain distribution tables approved by municipal departments. The language stayed cautious, inconclusive. Disturbed strata, urban interference likely, methodology sections shortened where deeper layers appeared. Numbers told a different story. Particle size distributions changed too cleanly. Sharp boundaries separated soil types that should have blended over time. Gravel lenses flattened like poured material. Clay horizons stretched laterally across multiple blocks. Recorded in separate redevelopment projects decades apart, construction timelines began to strain. If those layers predated resurfacing campaigns, then buildings had been modified after burial, not before it. If they postdated 19th century records, then excavation depths in the ledgers were incomplete. Neither option fit comfortably. Zones, marked for future redevelopment, began appearing in internal memoranda with new language attached. stabilization pending, access deferred, independent sampling unnecessary at present stage. Several sites flagged for sealing, permit applications stalled, archive requests returned partial files, entire soil profiles were summarized instead of reproduced, reduced to single-line conclusions that avoided depth figures altogether. The paperwork grew cautious. The material did not. Where brick fragments appeared beneath clay, foundations ended abruptly, their tops flattened as though cut clean before being submerged. Stone courses ran horizontally until they vanished into sediment rather than rising toward daylight. Buried architecture does not settle quietly. It waits. By the end of the geological files, the vocabulary shifted from technical to administrative. Restricted zones, deferred analysis, coordination required. The ground beneath Belgrade had stopped being a construction problem. It had become a procedural one. Soil profiles and buried windows pointed downward. Access records pointed nowhere at all. Maintenance requests described flooded chambers that did not appear on public schematics. Pump logs recorded water extraction from coordinates labeled only with internal codes. Ventilation diagrams traced airflow through volumes larger than utility crawl spaces, yet terminated at walls drawn solid on architectural plans. I began assembling these fragments into floor maps that did not officially exist. Corridors extended beneath courtyards before vanishing into blank zones. Service tunnels curved beneath buildings whose basements were supposedly shallow. Staircases descended from street level, then stopped in rectangles marked closed or inaccessible without explanation. Caretakers surfaced through initials beside valve checks. Plumbers logged pressure drops at depths no plan acknowledged. Inspectors noted sealed access points with dates and no follow-up. Fire marshals requested clearance routes. The requests went unanswered. Denial letters replaced engineering replies. Liability disclaimers appeared where load calculations should have been. Several departments returned the same phrase across different years and districts. Access restricted, pending review. No review documents were attached. Inspection appointments were cancelled days before scheduled entry. Project numbers vanished from registers. Emergency interventions became routine maintenance overnight, stripped of coordinates and depth figures. One ventilation diagram included a stair count that exceeded the building's height above ground. A later revision removed the staircase entirely. Correspondence narrowed in tone. Technical language gave way to legal caution. Phrases about heritage preservation and public safety clustered around the same properties that had generated flooding. Reports and structural concerns. Private consultations were referenced without minutes. Approvals that should have followed were never filed. Some were struck through, others were not recorded at all. By the time the maintenance logs reached their final revisions, the spaces beneath Belgrade had been converted into abstractions, zones, interfaces, restricted areas, not rooms, not corridors, not stairwells, just administrative silence where geometry had once been measured. Once access disappeared, money took its place. Excavation reports thinned out in municipal files after the first soil anomalies were recorded. In their absence, procurement registers expanded. Orders for crushed stone, lime mortar in volumes exceeding foundation repair needs. Asphalt shipments routed through districts where subsurface work had supposedly concluded. Emergency authorizations approved outside the normal tender cycle. I followed ledger codes instead of corridors. Each contract carried location markers that no longer appeared in engineering plans. Supplier invoices referenced cubic meters of fill material delivered to properties officially undergoing surface refurbishment. Labor allocations ballooned while inspection budgets contracted. Survey teams were reassigned to unrelated projects weeks before deeper cores were scheduled. Columns replaced cross-sections. Accountants appeared only through signatures in the margins. Council treasurers initialed accelerated payments. Contractors invoiced night work and sealed access points without describing what had been sealed. Several entries clustered tightly in time. Within 4 days, multiple districts received identical funding adjustments. Excavation lines struck through. Backfilling doubled. Completion deadlines advanced by months. Emergency clauses invoked where no disaster had been recorded. The language stayed procedural, operational necessity, risk mitigation, urban stabilization. No reports accompanied the decisions. Earlier survey requests vanished from later financial summaries. Their project numbers reappeared, attached to resurfacing initiatives and heritage reinforcement schemes that avoided depth figures entirely. One invoice described the transport of debris from below-grade structures. A later version shortened it to removal of spoil. Another replaced the phrase with site preparation. The amounts remained unchanged. When I overlaid spending patterns with cancelled inspections and sealed basements, the alignment stopped feeling coincidental. Resources flowed toward concealment at the exact moment access narrowed and documentation thinned. Budget committees had approved the shifts unanimously. No minutes recorded discussion. Treasury memos cited interdepartmental guidance without reproducing it. Authorizing bodies were named only by acronyms that referred back to one another in loops. At the bottom of several ledgers, the same accounting code appeared. Expedited closure, no definition followed. What had once been an engineering puzzle now carried institutional weight. Silence, it turned out, required funding. The paper trail climbed. Municipal correspondence ended where ministerial letterhead began. Directives arrived, folded into routine circulars, framed as safety coordination and infrastructure optimization, distributed to departments that had not requested. Intervention, the phrasing repeated with mechanical precision, temporary suspension of subsurface activity, reprioritization of urban stabilization, alignment with national risk frameworks. None cited measurements. I set the language beside the engineering reports. They replaced. Load calculations were absent from the orders. Soil classifications vanished. References to vaulted cavities and sealed corridors dissolved into generalized hazards, and this undefined void mitigation protocols. Where diagrams once appeared, there were only paragraphs. Titles replaced signatures. Deputy ministers, infrastructure secretaries, regulatory directors. The individuals behind the seals remained invisible, reduced to officers that authorized action without entering the technical record themselves. Several memos carried identical sentences, not similar, identical. Across agencies that normally issued independent assessments, the same cautionary clause surfaced word for word, down to punctuation. Closure pending comprehensive review by appropriate authorities. The authorities were never named. Dates told their own story. Engineering teams received suspension notices hours before scheduled inspections. Heritage boards were instructed to defer inquiries without explanation. Archive clerks logged classification changes on files that had not been requested for review. In one margin, a civil servant had written a question mark beside a paragraph. It had been crossed out in pencil. Subsequent releases to the public reframed the work as routine maintenance. No mention of depth, no reference to sealed staircases, no acknowledgement of the funding surge that accompanied sudden termination orders. The investigation had stopped being local. It had become procedural, and procedures, I was beginning to understand, traveled faster than soil. The public record did not match the private one. Municipal works had been mentioned in newspapers, but only briefly. Notices appeared in narrow columns near shipping schedules and commodity prices. Street resurfacing on King Milan Avenue. Drainage improvements near the river quarter. Temporary disruptions to tram routes. No mention of depth. I began to collect the clippings in chronological order. Short pieces clustered around the same weeks excavation teams were ordered to halt. Articles describing reopened streets appeared days after budgets had doubled for backfill. When corridors were sealed, the press recorded only accelerated modernization. Headlines stayed neutral. Maintenance, upgrades, stabilization, The tone never shifted, even when projects expanded in scale. No follow-up stories, no investigative features, no interviews with engineers who had filed contradictory reports inside municipal archives. Editors and printers existed only as mastheads. By the time names surfaced, they belonged to publishers long retired. Their personal correspondence archived elsewhere, inaccessible without special permission. One item ran for 3 sentences, another for 2, a third announced completion before procurement ledgers showed materials delivered. When I compared dates, patterns emerged, technical suspensions aligned with silence, emergency authorizations coincided with positive framing. Retrospective histories published decades later adopted the same. Vocabulary, describing raised street levels as organic urban evolution, omitting earlier strata entirely. Footnotes cited planning commissions. Those commissions had cited ministerial guidance. The guidance had replaced engineering diagrams. The loop closed neatly. What remained open were the measurements, the soil profiles, the vaulted spaces recorded and then omitted, the sealed stairwells that never reached print. Silence, once scattered, now stretched across decades. It had become structural, and it was being maintained. By the time every dataset was laid across the same timeline, coincidence no longer fit cleanly. Geological cores aligned with procurement spikes. Suspension orders appeared within hours of sediment anomalies. Newspaper silences followed. Sealed access points with predictable delay. Ministerial language replaced engineering. Vocabulary just as heritage boards were instructed to pause inquiries. Each category alone could be explained. Together, they formed a contour that felt engineered rather than accidental. I resisted naming it. Instead, I traced intersections. A trench logged in April reappeared as a resurfacing contract in May. A stairwell diagram archived in June vanished from planning briefs in July. Core samples flagged for secondary analysis were sealed under emergency clauses before laboratories issued full reports. The same accounting codes surfaced in districts kilometers apart. The same phrases migrated across departments that normally disagreed on terminology. Workers, surveyors, archivists, officials, journalists remained present only through artifacts they had left behind. Initials in margins, redacted paragraphs, procurement numbers without scope descriptions, headlines that never asked what lay beneath the pavement. The city began to look less like a collection of isolated projects and more like a system learning to live with something it had not built. The question shifted quietly, not what had been uncovered, but what had already been there. Vaulted ceilings documented and then erased, foundations deeper than 19th century engineering required, sublevels incorporated into drainage networks rather than excavated, street elevations raised until older layers disappeared into everyday infrastructure. Accommodation replaced investigation. Across decades, administrators adjusted rather than exposed. Engineers recalculated instead of excavating. Planners normalized depth discrepancies by building upward. Residents walked over revisions embedded in stone and sediment. No record explained who designed the buried structures. No archive preserved original construction permits. What survived were adaptations, policies shaped around absence, budgets devoted to concealment, language tuned to soften discovery. Standing at the end of the sequence, I could only map what converged, not why. The evidence refused to close into a theory. It stayed open, heavy, unresolved. A city resting on foundations no one officially remembered laying, and generations learning methodically to build on top of them anyway. In the end, the investigation did not conclude. It narrowed. There were still basements that could not be entered, corridors listed in ventilation diagrams that did not appear on emergency maps, archive boxes labeled with inventory numbers that corresponded to files no longer present inside them, permit requests suspended indefinitely under clauses that required no public justification. entire volumes removed from circulation, without replacement, copies logged. What remained accessible formed an outline rather than a statement. Patterns without signatures, decisions without recorded authors, foundations that existed in drawings but not in official histories. Institutions continued to surface only through the structures they maintained. Maintenance schedules replaced excavation proposals. Risk assessments substituted for geological inquiry. Policy memoranda grew longer as technical appendices disappeared. Silence became procedural, administered through routine. Standing above the streets where the earliest records pointed, I could only mark where access ended. The pavement resurfaced in phases, tram lines recalibrated, sewer upgrades routed around older voids, building permits approved, with footnotes referring to legacy conditions that no document ever defined. The conflict settled into its final form, not discovery versus denial, but memory versus erasure. The city moved forward, while its lower levels remained suspended in administrative amber, sealed behind legal language and deferred authority. Traffic passed overhead. Sidewalks filled. New facades rose without acknowledging what supported them. What lay beneath Belgrade did not demand belief. It demanded accounting, and until the archives opened, the chambers were entered and the foundations traced to their origin. The unanswered questions would remain embedded where the streets refused to look, waiting for someone with permission to dig again.